In the last episode, we heard all about the brutal murders of Agnes Ann Leroy and Hedvig Sammy Samuelson. We heard two wildly different versions of the same story. One version carefully crafted by the prosecution to paint Winnie Ruth Judd as a cold-blooded killer. The other from Winnie Ruth Judd herself and her story of self-defense. And now, in part 3, my friend Lynette will cover the highly publicized and highly questionable trial of Winnie Ruth Judd. The evidence, the testimony, the contradictions, and the many unanswered questions that still linger nearly 100 years later. Enjoy.
They called her the trunk murderess, the tiger woman, the blonde butcher. Her name was splashed across headlines from coast to coast. A Sunday school teacher turned cold-blooded killer. The petite, angel-faced woman accused of shooting her two friends to death, dismembering one of them, stuffing their bodies into travel trunks, and taking them with her on a train bound for L.A. By 1932, during the trial, the Great Depression had the American public starved for scandal, and Winnie Ruth Judd became the feast. The trial of Winnie Ruth Judd opened on January 19, 1932, at the Maricopa County Courthouse in downtown Phoenix. The charge? First-degree murder in the death of Ann Leroy. Although both Ann and Sammy had been killed, the state deliberately chose to prosecute only one count of murder, Ann's. And this was largely due to Sammy's dismemberment. I suppose now would be a good time to come clean about how my own personal fascination with this case began. In the late 90s and early 2000s, I was working my way through college as a legal secretary at a prestigious Arizona law firm. During those years, I had the honor of working with an attorney by the name of Jerry Lukowitz, the son of Herman Lukowitz, Winnie Ruth Judd's defense attorney. When Jerry learned that I was highlighting this case for my Arizona history class, he graciously invited me into his home and gave me access to his father's boxes of original case files. I spent hours combing through the pleadings, holding the letters Winnie had written to Herman from prison, even reviewing the original autopsy photos. And there's one image that I will never forget. Sammy's dismembered body laid out on the morgue table. Those cuts were so clean and so seamless that when they reassembled her, she fit back together like a jigsaw puzzle. It was clinical, precise, surgical. And that poses the question, how could such a frail 100-pound woman with tuberculosis, no surgical training, and nothing but a bread knife have performed the dismemberment like that? What about Winnie's own handwritten statement in a private letter, which read, "I was not present when dismemberment of the bodies and placement in the trucks took place. I admit this was a ghastly deed. I've asked God many times to forgive me for the part I played in transporting the trunks to Los Angeles, but I was sick, wounded, and suffering from shock." What about the supposed confession of a Dr. Brown, who was set to admit his involvement in the dismemberment, but who conveniently died by suicide the day before he was set to appear? What about the cab driver's statement that a man at the apartment helped Winnie load the trunks into the back of the cab? The prosecution, knowing they had no answers for these questions, elected to avoid them entirely by only prosecuting Winnie for Ann's murder, forever striking the unexplainable from record. But those weren't the only unexplainable aspects of this case. During the case, the state argued that jealousy and rage drove Winnie to kill. They painted her out as being obsessed with Ann and Sammy and angry over shared affections with Jack Halloran. Prosecutors claimed the murders were premeditated and that Judd's wounds were self-inflicted to support her self-defense story. Naturally, the defense took the opposite stance, that this was a struggle between three women fueled by illness, emotion, and fear, and that Winnie fought for her life. They emphasized her small stature, her chronic illness, and her injured left hand, which made it nearly impossible to effectively control a pistol. Additionally, by her own accounts, though Winnie admitted to shooting at Ann, she denied firing the fatal blow to Ann's temple. Her attorneys avoided spectacle by not calling her to testify, and instead they argued insanity. From the start, the evidence was chaotic. The crime scene had been compromised because shortly after the murders had occurred, the landlord sold tickets to the public for 10 cents apiece to view the murder house. By the time investigators arrived, the home had been combed over by a ravenous public who had trampled through blood and debris and evidence. Key physical evidence had vanished, most notably the 2 mattresses the women were supposedly killed on. Witnesses later testified that one of those mattresses had been found dumped in an alley with no blood on it, yet it was never entered into evidence. The other mattress was never recovered. Additionally, no axe, saw, or hatchet was ever found, again making Winnie's dismemberment of Sammy questionable. Jurors were confused. Some later admitted that the prosecution's presentation was disorganized and contradictory. Important timelines didn't match, the number of bullets were in question. Why was Sammy's murder not being mentioned? But the prosecutions leaned heavily into scandal and rage. Still, there were gaps in the prosecution's story, and the largest gap was Jack Halloran. His presence loomed over the entire trial. Yet prosecutors never called him to the stand. And Winnie faced the consequences of this crime alone. The jury faced extraordinary pressure, not only from the press, but from within the courthouse itself. Several jurors later came forward and swore under oath that they had been persuaded to impose the death penalty on the promise that doing so might compel Winnie to name her supposed accomplices. According to those affidavits, one jury in particular, former Mesa Mayor Dan Kleiman, had urged the others that a death sentence was the only way to get the truth. On February 8, 1932, after less than 3 hours of deliberation, the jury found Winnie Ruth Judd guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced her to death by hanging. Judge Howard Speakman signed the order setting her execution at the Arizona State Prison in Florence. Her defense team immediately appealed. They presented the juror's affidavit as proof of misconduct, arguing that the verdict had been influenced by coercion and improper motives. They also introduced new statements showing that Kleiman had allegedly bragged before the trial that he intended to convict Judd and send her to the gallows. But despite these findings, the Arizona Supreme Court upheld the conviction. Later that year, in December of 1932, and as Winnie awaited her execution, a Maricopa grand jury actually indicted Halloran as an accomplice to murder based on new testimony from Judd herself. She claimed that after the shooting, she had gone to Halloran for help, that he had returned with her to the bungalow, saw the bodies, and even brought a large trunk from his car, telling her not to say a word to anyone. During his preliminary hearing in January of 1933, Judd testified for nearly 3 days. She was emotional, exhausted, and unwavering. "I'm going to be hanged for something Jack Halloran is responsible for," she said. "He's guilty of anything I'm guilty of." Halloran's defense attorney countered that by Winnie's own testimony, the events she described were self-defense, meaning no actual murder had occurred, and therefore no one could be an accomplice to it. Despite the jury already having convicted Winnie of murder, the judge agreed. And on January 25th, 1933, he dismissed the charges against Jack Halloran entirely, calling the state's case an idle gesture. Once again, all the blame for the crime laid solely on Winnie's shoulders, sending her to the gallows to hang alone. That might have been the end of it had it not been for Sheriff John McFadden. The same lawman who had arrested Judd now publicly questioned whether justice had been served. Authorities then sought a competency review, and a 10-day psychiatric hearing was held at the state prison in Florence. The doctors concluded that Judd had been sane at the time of killings, meaning she had understood her actions, but that she had since become mentally unstable and unfit for execution. It was an unusual and contradictory ruling, sane enough for guilt, but too insane to hang. On April 24, 1933, after the competency hearing, her death sentence was set aside and she was committed to the Arizona State Asylum for the Insane, ending one of the most sensational murder trials in state history. Her case closed with more questions than answered, a muddled record of missing evidence, conflicting testimony, and political pressure. The newspapers had called her the trunk murderess. The state now called her insane. And the truth was likely left hanging somewhere in the air, even to this day. Winnie Ruth Judd would forever be known as the trunk murderess, the woman who killed her 2 friends, dismembered one, and stuffed their bodies in trunks bound for LA. But as the legal chapter of her case came to a close, an equally bizarre chapter was just beginning. What followed wasn't an ending. It was a decades-long odyssey through asylums, escapes, and reinvention. So tune into the next episode as we conclude the tale of the Trunk Murderess.